There has just been an attempted coup d'etat in the Turkish Republic. It's been several days since the coup was defeated, and the topic naturally slid off the front page of the Cathedral Media. Now that's all fine and dandy except for one thing. How come nobody bothered to at least lay out a 5th grade analysis so at least the general public has a broad idea about the situation? This is probably the first time in recent years when both the anti-NATO media, like the Duginist RT or the Islamist Al Jazeera, and the pro-NATO media, like the BBC, Sky News, France 24 and others, offer a broadly ignorant and devoid of context coverage of such a significant event in a NATO country. Amazing. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, before I say anything else, I recommend you all to watch this video called Political Islam in Secular Turkey, a video that I uploaded in August 2015, and in which I provided quite a lot of context as to how Islamism is seen in Turkey and why it matters. Basically, once one has a fundamental understanding on how the Turkish Republic is supposed to work, the attempted coup of last Friday makes perfect sense. The Turkish military was envisioned by the founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, as being the final guarantor of secularism in the Republic. As a result, coups by the military when the civil administration became a little bit too Islamist aren't really unheard of. In fact, they're part and parcel of practical Turkish politics. At one point, there was one coup d'etat every 10 years, so the hysterical reaction of the media shows how little journalists tend to know about things about which they report on. However, something went a little bit different this time. Now, in addition to failing to depose Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Binali Yıldırım cabinet, this military coup did not have the full support of the entire military, as it is usually the case when these things happen. And this time it also involved civilian deaths, which is again untraditional for the otherwise traditional military coup that occur in Turkey once in a while. So with that in mind, let's go through 3 aspects that have been barely analyzed by the Cathedral Media, aspects that are, at least in my view, a lot more important than the usual platitudes peddled by both RT and the BBC. So 1. Understanding Erdogan and the Yıldırım cabinet. 2. Muhammed Fethullah Gulen and the Gulen movement. And 3. Immediate consequences following this attempted coup. So, in order to understand why secular Turkey and basically anyone who is not an Islamist or a neo-Ottomanist was cheering for the army and hoping the coup would be successful, one has to understand not just the basics of the Turkish state and the whole portion of the Atatürk legacy, but also the extraordinary developments after the year 2013. You see, Erdogan has always been a friend of authoritarianism, but as long as the presidency has a rather Kemalist leaning, the danger of destabilizing the secular establishment was kept at bay. And this was indeed the case until 2014, when the term of the last president, Abdullah Gül, has ended and Recep Tayyip Erdogan was elected as his successor. That's when things started to change, and not for the better. One by one, all the previous allies of Recep Tayyip Erdogan from the time he was a prime minister were alienated as he set up to fundamentally transform Turkey. Sounds familiar? Basically, he wanted to fundamentally transform Turkey from a secular modern state into a more Islamist Ottomanist state. In fact, Erdogan made no secret in the last 3 years that he pursues a neo-Ottomanist policy. His words, not mine. Anyway, this is a very long story, but the short version is pretty much like this. He alienated the moderate and reformist Muslims led by Muhammed Fethullah Gulen in 2013. Then he alienated the secular politician and former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu in 2015. he did his best to purge any dissent from the AKP, that is Erdogan's party and the current ruling party, and the final move in that direction was confirmed in May this year when head of the party and prime minister was confirmed Binali Yildirim, by far the most loyal lapdog for Erdogan, with an impeccable track record in defending the most abhorrent state abuses, if that meant preserving power for Erdogan and the AKP clique. Now just a quick list. Binali Yildirim defended, amongst other things, the imprisonment of inconvenient journalists, increased state surveillance Iran-style, sex segregation at public events, Saudi Arabia style, and egregious government corruption that make Putin or Hillary Clinton look like noble statesmen in comparison. So this is actually the Prime Minister right now, a Prime Minister regarded both by his supporters and by his critics as a low-profile individual who is in this position solely to quietly oversee the transition of the Turkish Republic from a parliamentary democracy towards an executive presidency. Now, in addition to transferring as much power as possible from the parliament and the Prime Minister into the hands of the President, there is also a pressing need in the neo-Ottomanist camp to rewrite that pesky constitution that still stands in the way of completely Islamizing Turkey through elements such as empowering the military to enforce secularism if necessary. This is basically the price Turkey has had to pay so far in order to avoid descending into chaos and/or into Islamist tyranny, like it happened with Iran or more recently with Egypt. Anyway, in presenting the Yildirim cabinet, I mentioned the name Muhammed Fethullah Gulen, and the reason I did that is because during the Friday night events, Prime Minister Yildirim himself mentioned this name, suggesting that he might be behind the attempted coup. I'm personally not buying that, but regardless of my opinion, one should at least know who the guy is and what his movement does before formulating an opinion. Basically, Muhammad Fethullah Gulen is a former imam of Hanafi school of thought, which is one of the most moderate Islamic schools of thought, part of the Sunni doctrine with adherents predominantly in Turkey, Bosnia, Albania, Russia, Kazakhstan, China, and Kyrgyzstan, as well as other areas where they do not comprise a majority. Anyway, long story, but basically, the Hanafi school of thought is one of the few, if not the only, Islamic schools of thought that can indeed coexist with non-Islamic communities. Now, at one moment in time, Fethullah Gulen realized that even though the Hanafi school of thought is decent, it can be made even more decent and indeed a source of enlightenment within Islam if it is modified even further to be, more compatible with the 21st century. As a result, he dropped the whole imam thingy and became what is usually referred to as being a non-denominational Muslim, which is actually a thing. Maybe one day I'll make a video about these people. But anyway, Fethullah Gulen gathered lots of people around him who think like him, namely that curbing Islamism must come from within Islam, and that instead of whining about Islamophobia, non-Islamists would better actually support superior and more civilized alternatives. Now, long story short, his movement now operates several hundreds of educational institutions around the world and actively pulls pupils away from the Salafist radical madrasas and towards schools that actually teach pupils how to be civilized. Now, obviously, the Islamists don't like him and his movement, especially since he also sponsored various forms of interfaith dialogues, or when his newspaper in Turkey became the most widely circulated paper because of the fact that it tended to present things in such a way that it appealed both to the deeply religious non-Kemalist population and to the ultra-secular modernist elites of Istanbul and Ankara. Again, very long story. Now, Fethullah Gulen and his movement came on the wrong side of Mr. Erdogan in 2013, and when then the Prime Minister Erdogan accused the Gulen movement of trying to overthrow the democratic government of Turkey using corruption scandals to create the premises for a judicial coup. Now, no evidence of that being true has ever been presented, but even if that were true, it still doesn't change the fact that the Erdogan cabinet of 2013 was indeed highly corrupt, as shown by the results of the investigations, And if the Gulen movement had any involvement in that, facts show that it was indeed in the best interest of the Republic to be involved in the first place. Again, that is assuming that Erdogan wasn't just being paranoid and lying, as it's usually the case. Anyway, after that moment, the Gulen movement's newspaper, Zaman, which, as I said, was the most widely circulated paper in 2013, was nationalized by the state at the order of Erdogan, and the journalists subjected to various levels of legal chicanery, a state of affairs that continued all the way till March this year, when the full control of the government of that newspaper was finally established. Now, I'll leave links in the low bar for further reading about the Orwellian fashion under which the very fact that this newspaper was nationalized has been concealed on the pages of that newspaper. It's really sickening. But anyway, the Gulen movement can be accused of many things, such as of being subversive, perhaps of being a bit too rich, maybe even of being annoying. But terrorists who finance military coups? Highly unlikely. Now, even the critics of the movement say that the members are annoyingly obedient to their leader, an aspect that is not denied by its supporters either. Yet the leader, Fethullah Gulen himself, condemned the attempted regime's change through a military coup, insisting that reform can be achieved through democratic or, at the very least, more peaceful means. So, the bottom line is, the Gulen movement, talking point of the Erdogan Islamists, simply does not hold to basic scrutiny. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to the immediate consequences following this attempted coup. Well, completely unsurprisingly, the Islamist administration is using the coup to crack down on any remaining dissent against Erdogan. Just one day after the army surrendered its arms, 2,745 judges, including 5 members of the highest judiciary board, were removed from duty. All of these will soon to be replaced, of course, with Erdogan loyalists. And this means just one thing. The effort to rewrite the constitution has just gotten easier. It would be quite surprising if Erdogan will not attempt to do it again this year. By the same token, though, it would also be quite surprising if the military will not attempt another coup this year as well. Basically, it's bad. But then again, it was bad before this attempted coup anyway, so for as long as the Erdogan regime is there, things simply cannot get better. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that removing Erdogan will magically make things better either. I mean, after all, if Erdogan is removed and replaced with an even harsher Islamist, like it happened in Egypt with Mohamed Morsi's Islamist coup, that is bound to make things even worse. Also, we should also not forget the Duginist implications of last Friday's event. Now, I know it's not fashionable to talk about the dangers of Russian involvement and aggression, but then again, I'm not here to be popular nor fashionable. Now, before I close, let me spend a few more moments on the Friday night events themselves. Now, according to both the pro-coup forces and the pro-Erdogan forces, a portion of the military set out to seize control in a largely peaceful manner, just like it happened with so many of the previous bloodless military coups in Turkey's history. Now, everything worked as planned up to a point. The military occupied the bridges, the airports, the media, and ordered the civilians to stay indoors. Then at one point, Erdogan himself goes live via FaceTime broadcast and asks the civilians to disobey the military and go out in the streets in support of him and his regime. And so they did. Again, this is not disputed by any of the parties of the argument. Because the Turkish military is not in the habit of killing civilians, the coup eventually failed because the soldiers simply surrendered, considering the fact that their supporters were indoors as instructed, and the only way to move forward would have been to brutally suppress the civilian protests, which is something that the Turkish military isn't exactly known for. Again, this is not disputed by any parties of the argument. What is disputed, however, is the role of the police. Now, did the police join the military or remain loyal to Erdogan? And if the police was split on this issue, how many policemen joined the coup and how many did not? Quite frankly, I don't know, and I'm still trying to figure that one out. Now, this question is relevant because that is a way to untangle who exactly killed those people. because during the Friday night I stayed up all night watching around 12 or 13 live streams at the same time, and I did see the police firing at the crowd, but then I also saw the military firing at the police. Now, for those that are highly conspiracy-minded, this fact alone was enough for them to conclude that this was a false flag, which in turn split the conspiracy-minded crowd into 2 or 3 groups, depending on whom they blamed the false flag on. However, as someone who knows firsthand how these things of politically unstable moves occur in real life, I simply do know better that in times like these, a certain degree of confusion is not only acceptable, but to be expected, for the simple reason that you cannot control everyone all the time, not even if you're the Turkish military that is experienced in staging coups d'etats once in a while. But anyway, whether this was a false flag or not, the consequences of this failure will be dire on the short run for any remaining freedoms in the Turkish Republic, and on the long run, if Erdogan's purging plan succeeds, there is a potential for the abolition of the Kemalist Republic, which is simply not good news for anyone. Now, I wish I had better news, but such are the times we live in. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and if you do have alternative hypotheses, please do provide them in the low bar. Now, in the meantime, I'll try to convince a Turkish friend to come on this channel for an interview, and hopefully we'll get to untangle this mess even further. But until then, thank you for your support, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.